I'm here with Cameron Wilson. Cameron Wilson, along with Sergio Guzman, just completed an in-depth report on Colombian President Ivan Duque's midterm performance, his challenges and opportunities. Cameron, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Let's get into it. It's a fascinating report, a long, in-depth report. You guys obviously spent a lot of time on it. I guess first, tell me a little bit about your background and how you came to be affiliated with Sergio and Colombia Risk Analysis.
Okay, sure. Well, I'm in my late 20s. I grew up on the east coast of the U.S. in Connecticut, and at the moment, I'm a student at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, which is sort of one of the, I guess, handful of policy schools that people go to study sort of IR, economics, do some language training. It's called SAIS for short, and it's in DC, and it's sort of part of the community of Georgetown, Columbia, Harvard Kennedy School. And I wound up with Sergio because I was looking for something to do over the summer, like a work experience. And this pandemic that's upended all of our lives, I was going to be in Bogota for probably 12 weeks or so, basically helping his company with their product they put out on a monthly, sometimes a weekly basis, and doing some translation work as well. And so that was how I wound up connecting with Sergio. I was looking for that opportunity over the summer.
Great. Well, it's obviously a first-class report. Let's start into it. Colombia is a politically polarized country. You've got a group of hard-left politicians and their supporters. You have a group of hard-right politicians and their supporters. And then you have a large, maybe non-aligned electorate that seems to largely be fed up with both camps. So can Duque get reelected in short, and how, if he can?
Well, to clarify, I mean, I think you're probably asking, can a more right-wing candidate get reelected, given that now presidents cannot serve consecutive terms, which is sort of an interesting wrinkle in the sort of ebb and flow of Colombian politics. So he could run again in the future, but not in 2022. He'd have to sit out a term and run again, I guess, in 2026 would be the earliest possible opportunity. But that seems fairly unlikely at the moment, given that his approval ratings are at historically low levels. And over the next 2 years, it's hard to envision a scenario in which he'll be able to attract more favorable public opinion, even if he somehow, reaches out towards the middle from his sort of hard right party, the Democratic Center, or in my gringo way of speaking, the Democratic Center. And so at this point, it seems like a long shot that either he would stand for re-election in 2026, or frankly, that even his party would have a successful go of it in this next presidential election.
We already saw one Centro Democrático senator announce that she was going to run. Is there a chance that, or I don't remember the law, I guess Uribe cannot run anymore, can he?
Well, so I think that at the end of his second term back in 2010, there was a little bit of legal wrangling over his ability to run again. And popular as he might have been at that moment, I think by and large Colombians were glad that he couldn't stand for a third term. And no, so he cannot run for a third term. And also, the days of like even President Juan Manuel Santos serving 2 consecutive terms, those days are over as well. Now, if a president is to stand for a second term, it has to be a non-consecutive term. Yeah.
I'm speaking to you from here in Medellin, and he still has quite a considerable base of supporters. I'm saying Uribe, not Duque.
Yeah, it seems like his supporter base, for the most part, is socially conservative, a little bit older, and probably had more experience with the massive disruption that was this longstanding insurgency on the lives of Colombians everywhere. And I'm sure most people listening to this this episode are sort of familiar with his biography, but that played a large role in his early life. And for better or worse, the Colombian electorate skews sort of younger. The average age hovers around 30. And so as we move on and on and on, one thing that sort of emerges is the population has less and less experience with the hardship that caused. And that might be one reason why why Uribe and his party's demand for like retribution and maybe a little bit more discomfort with the transitional justice scheme for FARC dissidents. All of that makes them more uncomfortable in a way that's less common with people that are my age, you might say. And it's only going to continue to be that way.
It sounds almost like it's mirroring the situation with Cuban Americans in Miami, where there's a generational divide between the older, people who escaped Cuba and who maybe suffered firsthand, and then maybe their children who have more of an emotional attachment. And then I think there's a younger generation that seems to be more flexible. And it's not that they're necessarily, pro Castro, but they don't have the emotional, visceral response and are open to at least some kind of dialogue. Even that doesn't necessarily mean that they're for normalizing relations or anything like that.
Huh. I don't have any experience with that community, and haven't been to Cuba in the way I've been to Colombia, but I mean, that sounds very similar to me. Yeah, that's interesting observation.
Yeah, I think there's a difference because I think you have people here, and I talk to people, even neighbors, and if they're older, let's say older than 50, and they lived in those troubled times, then they have a maybe, especially, and then also it depends on if they were urban or rural as well, because maybe Uribe and the military or the government at that time came in and cleaned up where you lived, or maybe they came and cleaned out where you lived, right? And so you can have a completely opposite perspective on things. If you look at the still unresolved case of the false positives and things like that, and even Uribe right now, this week is in the Supreme Court where he is under a legal cloud and potentially facing charges. It's hard to imagine where that might go, but it's not like the view of him as a hero or a savior is universal, even though there are some that definitely strongly believe that. Obviously, the base of the Centro Democrático Party is made up of those supporters, I would think.
Yeah, and I think that his approval ratings upon leaving office were 75-80%, something like that. And now they're down to 30 or something. And he might not care. People in his party might not be that bothered by his slide in approval ratings. But I think part of that goes back to what you're saying. It's like the experience of Colombians in the 80s and 90s and even before that. Sort of fading into memory for people who are my age or college students, and as long as the average age of the electorate or the average age of the country, stays around 30, that's not going to get reversed.
Right. How is President Duque handling the coronavirus pandemic? He seems to be butting heads with Bogota's mayor, Claudia Lopez.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's sort of a few, sort of a multifaceted answer. In comparison to his counterparts in my country and in other parts of Latin America, you might say he's an admirable job in the sense that President Bolsonaro in Brazil has been willfully ignorant of the science, and some people would say that AMLO in Mexico has been the same way, and a lot of people would say that President Trump has also adhered to that, let's not listen to the experts and listen to the science, and also not recommend social distancing and masks. Okay. By the same token, most of the earliest and most, the strongest calls for lockdowns, for social distancing, for masks, were from Colombia's mayors and not from President Duque. And so in comparison to them, he looks like he's a little bit slow, a little bit reckless even. But compared to his counterparts outside the country, you might say, oh, well, he's sort of responsible and he's been advocating for wearing masks. He puts I got a water bottle here. He puts his hand sanitizer on his, see if I can, he puts his hand sanitizer on his desk every night.
Yes.
Every night, yeah. So, and he's doing an okay job, I suppose, in managing the crisis, or managing the health effects, if you will. People would argue about his economic response, but that's a separate question.
He used an interesting phrase, sort of responsible. I don't know if they want to make that a campaign phrase. But it's interesting. I think that he was seen as doing an okay job until the COVID Fridays, as they were calling the Dia Sin IVAs down here, the day without sales tax, especially the first one that turned into a fiasco, with stores being shut down for overcrowding, and then a resultant spike in cases. And you see that we've gone from 1,000 cases to now over 10,000. No, 1,000 deaths to now over 10,000 deaths in the space of a month.
The images were pretty
economically. I'm sorry.
I said the images from that. I guess there was that day and another one 2 weeks later, and the footage was shocking.
It left an impression. Economically, obviously, he's under a lot of pressure. The economy is contracting. Colombia being a tourist country, tourism is completely shut down. The restaurants are closed except for carry out or delivery. The airlines, Avianca is obviously in bankruptcy, as is LATAM. There's like, with two small exceptions, there's no passenger air traffic. So he is under a lot of pressure there, I think. But a lot of people are saying that Claudia Lopez is already campaigning for president, based on her response. And I don't know if that's honest or cynical or both. But she does seem to be a lot less conciliatory than she was during her campaign. And as the mayor of Bogota, she certainly does have a considerable megaphone. The vice president, Marta Lucia Ramirez, is not having so good of a year, is she?
Well, you said I used an interesting phrase, sort of responsible. Well, not having such a good year is an interesting phrase in that context. Yeah.
Yeah, we saw.
On the one hand, to speak about it briefly, I mean, one thing that sort of dragged her down a few months ago was this revelation that she paid bail for her brother in Miami back in the 90s. Her brother was convicted of some drug trafficking. I think it was heroin.
Yes.
And it was sort of a small amount. I want to say the bail was like $150. So it wasn't didn't rise to the scale of some corruption. But on the other hand, nobody knew it. Nobody knew about it in a public sphere until this time. And she's had sort of a long career, right? She's a little bit older than Duque. She's been in the public eye for quite a while. And then another thing that happened sort of recently that only some very close followers of the country would have noticed is she threatened to file a lawsuit, I believe, against Incite Crime.
She did file it. She filed criminal, not just a civil lawsuit, she filed criminal charges against Incite Crime in June. But McDermott, instead of, I guess, going quietly, published that, and that same week that he went public with the charges, which were widely condemned by journalism and human rights organizations, and I would imagine the many foreign governments that fund Incite Crime, to be completely honest.
And she's backed down since then, right?
She's retracted them. But the thing that's amazing is that even though she filed charges, her husband admitted the facts of McDermott's story, which was interesting. That seemed to be a dumb move politically because, I mean, it's not that he published anything false, and that's not even a judgment call. Her husband confirmed that did the deal with this guy Memo Fantasma, this ex-paramilitary narco trafficker guy. And the interesting thing is that now the inside crime reporting never accused the vice president or her husband of doing anything illegal or even unethical. They bought a lot from some guy, and if you buy a house, you don't necessarily know much about the people who sell you the house, right? So I think that I don't know if it's kind of surprising that they handled that so badly politically, but I think that what came to light is the kind of pressure and bullying that can take place, and when people are not are used to working in impunity or used to operating in impunity and don't expect uh,
To be held
to
accountable.
have that scrutiny applied to them, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I would
For
imagine
sure.
it's hard to see her career going beyond the vice presidency, but you never know. I noticed in there you guys listed as potential candidates Pacho Santos. You think he might actually run?
I think before the trouble that he found himself in last fall, he I think he would have said that for sure he would have run. To be clear, he found himself in some hot water when a recorded conversation from a restaurant in D.C. was made public by a Colombian newspaper, and he said some unflattering things about the U.S. State Department, which to some observers might compromise his main role, right, as the main representative, the main go-between between Colombia's government and the U.S. And so to clarify, before that, which was last fall, you would have said, yeah, he'll for sure run, and he's had an ambition of that for a while. And he's been involved in Colombian politics for a while, and he moves in the right circles. It's quite a small group of people who are
Yes.
at the top of Colombian politics to begin with, and then amongst the different segments, right, center left, center right. The circles are even smaller, and part of it is that there's so few families, and that the men go to the same high school in Bogota. So he sort of ticks all the boxes, and he for sure still has that amount of ambition. And I think to a lot of observers, the question would be, well, what does Uribe want? Basically, who does Uribe think are the most attractive candidates for his party the next go round? And he's had a history as well of sometimes. Well, part of the debate is whether this is his doing or the party's doing, but the party has a history of pushing forward a few candidates and sort of seeing which one happens to capture the imagination of the electorate that year. And for sure, Pacho Santos would be in that conversation, if you will. But it's a little bit harder to say that he for sure is the guy.
Another possibility that you guys floated that really intrigued me was Mauricio Cardenas, the former finance minister, who was very well respected and even liked, but he hasn't, and maybe that this is by design or by his personality, but he's never really come across as a politician. And that's not to say he's not a political operator, but he, as far as I know, he's never held political office. He's more of a technocrat, isn't he?
Yeah, he's an economist, basically.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
There is one argument or one school of thought that a technocrat might be able to steer clear, let's say, of some of this like tug of war politically back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
And some of that might be why a candidate like Fajardo is like, oh, I'm just a professor,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not cut from that same sort of cloth. And so there's an argument that perhaps Cardenas would be able to navigate that dynamic a little bit better. And since he hasn't, he hasn't really like played that game to this point. He hasn't spent his career criticizing the opposition. That if the sort of conservative side of Colombian politics wanted to nominate like a more moderate candidate, one that wasn't so hardline, one that might capture the middle of the electorate, he might be, worthwhile person for them to put forward.
It seems though that I think that the hard part for him not being a politician is you can run into the same dangers of inexperience. We look at Daniel Quintero here in Medellin, the mayor, who seems like a nice enough guy, but he's already gotten himself into some hot water, making some politically not smart comments. And even if they might make sense in a non-political world, you're in a political world. And it's like this statement this action will not really necessarily get you any help, but it will get you a lot of stomach ache and a lot of Pepto-Bismol drinking, I think. But it's interesting, and so I think that the danger is when you have somebody, especially like an economist, which people like to deride as a dismal science. I don't think so, but the more honest you are, it's like an honest economic statement is a polar opposite of a smart political statement, I think, and so
There's some truth to
that
that
makes
in
it
the
hard
hard
to get
choices.
elected as an economist, right?
There's some truth to that in the hard choices that they might advocate, you know. And I think the debate you're talking about there is a little bit playing out right now within like mainstream economics. You know, there's a lot of what would be formerly like radically left economic ideas that are being enacted into policy right now. Universal basic income, these, you know, debt levels that make people that scare people, maybe less than they would have in the past, but certainly it's like it's unknown territory, and it's kind of frightening for some people who have a hard time looking past what they were taught if they were going to some, you know, if they were going to U Chicago 30 years ago. And yeah, and so that tug of war is going on within economics right now. I mean, is it irresponsible for governments to keep subsidizing wages and preventing layoffs, even if it runs up the national debt? Some economists would say, just do it, press the button and go for it. You know, what are we so scared of? The only thing worse would be not doing anything.
Everybody loves Keynes and nobody loves Hoover in a recession, right?
Right. So yeah, so that debate, like the sort of whether economists are always bringing bad news or not, is sort of like that's playing out right now in the news every day.
Good point. Good point. So where do we go from here? We're a little bit past, I think, halfway in Duque's term. We're in the middle of a COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic that's hitting Colombia hard. Other countries worse, but it still is significant here. The economy is contracting because of this, and the economic contraction exacerbated by the collapse in demand for petroleum, well below Colombia's lift cost. That's to say, the price to get it out the ground into the refinery or into the pipelines is higher than the actual cost of petroleum right now, and we don't see that, you know, bouncing back anytime in the short term. And that's an important source of revenue for the Colombian government. So that leaves the president with fewer levers to pull as he gets closer to a time where he needs to pull them. And I don't know how much, you know, I think pundits talk about legacies more than maybe politicians, but maybe they do think about that. And so what can he do? And what is he likely to do? Do you see him in the second half of his term distancing himself from his political patron Alvaro Uribe, or will he cement a legacy as a faithful acolyte and beneficiary of his patron?
Yeah. Well, the fundamental question is to sort of steer the country through this crisis is going to require him leaving behind some of the main policies of the Democratic Center. And a big part of that is the sort of commitment to fiscal responsibility that I sort of alluded to just now, in the way the economists might be fighting with each other about what to do. And so if he's to adhere to this sort of more orthodox fiscal management that is a tenure of his party, and that his Secretary of the Treasury or Secretary of Hacienda adheres to. That'll be him, being loyal to Uribe, to Uribismo, but also letting the country flounder a little bit longer than people might think it is ideal. And if he is to continue to lift public spending, extend the subsidies that have been given to people, extend the subsidies that have been given to businesses, that'll be him moving towards the center and shepherding the country. What most observers would say is in a more responsible way. And our expectation is that he's probably not going to do that based on a couple of is that so far in his presidency, he's been largely loyal to Uribismo. Part of that's been close ties to the business community, closer than some people might feel good about. And you can see that in how we opened up the economy for 2 days for everybody to go shopping in the middle of a pandemic. And part of that commitment has also been in this idea to sort of drag your feet, slow down the progress of the peace accord. And so he's been loyal to this point, and therefore we don't have a lot of reason to expect he's going to move towards the middle anytime soon.
Interesting. And I think that might be the biggest danger to his legacy is in the post-peace accord implementation, and whether you like it or not, whether you agree with it or not, if you look at the increase in danger for social leaders, for indigenous Colombians, and people that are not even necessarily political actors or not even necessarily natural political opponents, there's just been and I think it would be hard to argue otherwise, a negligence on the part of the government to protect non-combatants. And even if let's suppose you're anti-FARC, or which I think a lot of people except for the FARC are anti-FARC, but let's suppose you're anti-peace accords. But then you have members of the FARC who say, okay, we're going to leave the FARC, or we're going to not be combatants anymore. We're going to stop. And the government says, okay, we're going to put you in this place and get you reintegrated in society. But then they go and get massacred. That doesn't really, even if you don't like the peace accord, if you don't like the FARC, the last thing you want is people to go back and rearm themselves. So I think it's kind of beyond comprehension. Other than, is it just incompetence, or is there some kind of design behind purposefully letting? I mean, it would only seem that the only reason behind not protecting people is to drive them back into arms.
Yeah. Well, what's the question exactly? I mean, I agree with what you said, but what's the question?
So I guess is that that's a good question itself. I should have been more concise. I think that is it just negligence, or is there a political motivation behind that foot dragging? Not necessarily to implement faithfully every little bit of it, because that might even be too much to expect politically. But in the negligence, or the apparent negligence, and the lack of protection, and the increase in danger to even non-political non-combatants, indigenous leaders, social rights, people who are advocating non-political things. You find water for our neighborhood, and then they're assassinated.
Yeah, I think it's both of those things. I mean, I think with regards to the FARC, there's no willingness to follow through on the provisions to provide them with a successful reintegration. And so what that looks like in the short term is to build resettlement camps that have, schools and reasonable health care. And it took them a long time to get running water in a couple places. And also put the camps in places that are safe, that aren't close to still violent groups of people. And to provide them with protection. So there's a clear negligence to not follow through on all of those promises. With regards to the violence, the insecurity that's confronting people, or that's affecting people who are not part of the FARC, but who are in rural areas, who are agitating for clean water, roads, schools, electricity, basically an expanded state presence. Part of the problem there is, I think, a bit of negligence, a little bit of, well, this is going to serve to benefit park dissidents in some kind of ways. But also another part of it too is that this is the sort of long and hard and boring and challenging work that's going to take 10 to 15 years, even in the best case, because these areas are so remote. To expand the state presence requires tremendous amount of patience. And if there's one thing Colombia is lacking, even between a lot of the larger cities, is good transportation. It's sort of a weak spot of the country, if you like. So that's sort of like the long and hard and dirty work that's going to take a long time, no matter what. But they're not helping. They're not sort of pushing that as aggressively as they could be. And in the meantime, while the state presence is sort of lacking in these areas, and you're talking about how social leaders sort of, I don't know how much the audience is going to know what that term means, maybe quite a lot, but if we say social leaders are, broadly speaking, people agitating for improvement in their security and economic conditions in all these areas, they're sort of out in the wind, so to speak, without any help from the government or without any protection. And 100% it's negligence. There's nothing else than negligence that's sort of leaving them so vulnerable. And in some cases more vulnerable during the lockdown, because if they were targets before, but maybe they were evading their attackers or evading pressure, this lockdown made it frighteningly easy to know where people were. And that's just it's just to say that they're putting up with all kinds of threats and pressure and violence that they shouldn't have to, and that the government has no good reason to allow that to continue or not to make more efforts to prevent it.
Insightful. One last question. You were a professional PGA golfer, and is there any good golf in Colombia?
Didn't expect to get asked that. Yeah, there is. So, there is. One of the sort of unfortunate parts of golf in Latin America is that it happens to be confined to the very highest strata of society. And golf is sort of an affluent game all over the place, but there's public golf all over the US. It's accessible. Maybe not accessible enough, but it's accessible. And in Colombia, there's just private golf courses. And so nice as they might be, and I've been to a few of them in Bogota and Medellin, beautiful as they might be, one of the things that I wish was different about golf in Latin America is that it was accessible to everyone. But maybe that'll change someday. I'm not hopeful about it, but maybe it'll change. And I guess to go back to the first part, there are some beautiful clubs, and I think the consensus would be that the best one in Bogota would be called Los Lagartos, which has 2 golf courses in the middle of the city. And then another popular spot is called, I think it's just called Contrico de Bogota, or in Usaquén. And that's a cool place with a couple of nice golf courses and some cool amenities as well. Bowling alley, squash courts, clay tennis courts, soccer field. That's kind of an interesting spot with a lot of other, a lot of other fun activities. But yeah, I wasn't expecting to get asked that. So thanks for digging up my past. Thanks for digging up what I did before going to SAIS.
No, I'm a tennis person myself. I'm not a golf person, but being born and raised in the same hometown of Jack Nicklaus, you can't. It's he's just a giant, and he actually, his firm designed the Caravana golf course up in Cartagena. And I'm not really a golf player, so I haven't played the course, but I've been to the Caravana, and it's a really lovely facility. And I was there right before the pandemic started, and I hope to go back reasonably soon as it's safe to maybe play some tennis. But I was really impressed with their facilities. I don't know if you played that course, but it looked really nice. And
in my prior life,
remembered it. I'm sorry.
Well, in my prior life, so when I was playing golf professionally, I wound up going to Colombia 4 times, and I played an event at TPC Caravana when it was brand new in the spring of 2015, I think it was. Maybe like March of 2015, and it was beautiful. It's an amazing spot, and hopefully it's a place where Colombians can go to enjoy some of their time that they already go to Cartagena all the time, but hopefully it's sort of adds one more thing to the city that'll attract people, and also it's a really easy place to get to for Americans. It's a couple hours from Florida, and if anybody has like hesitations or some concerns about going to Latin America and going to Colombia, which they shouldn't by and large, that's like a really great introduction to what can be so great about spending time in the region.